The Hells Angels biker watched the little girl lift a frostbitten box, and the code inside set his past on fire. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. On a freezing winter's evening, the wind howled down the streets of a small town, rattling windows and sending flurries of snow swirling into the air. The temperature had dropped below 30 degrees, and everything seemed to be encased in a thick layer of ice, including the streets. As the snow settled, an eerie silence covered the town. It was on this night that Marcus Steele Thompson, a grizzled member of the Hells Angels, found himself in a situation he never could have anticipated. His motorcycle rumbled down the snow-covered street, the engine's growl barely breaking the cold silence. He had been on the road for hours, and the storm was getting worse by the minute. Marcus's mind was preoccupied with thoughts of the next chapter meeting, and the cold weather didn't help his mood. Suddenly, his headlights caught something unusual in the distance. An abandoned bicycle lay half-buried in the snow, a sign that something, or someone, was amiss. His instinct as a biker kicked in, but he hesitated. With the storm growing stronger, it wasn't safe to stop. But something about the scene tugged at his heartstrings, pulling him closer. As he slowed down, his eyes caught the faint figure of a small girl huddled by a nearby porch, looking helpless and lost. She was struggling to lift something that appeared to be a box, its edges covered in frost. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary child. Despite the fierce cold, she was determined, her small hands grasping at the frozen box with more strength than a child her size should have. He pulled up beside her, the rumble of his Harley cutting through the night. The girl froze at the sound, her wide eyes meeting his, a mix of fear and confusion in her gaze. Marcus dismounted quickly, walking toward her, his boots crunching in the snow. "Hey, are you all right?" he called out, his voice softer than usual, trying not to scare her. The girl didn't respond immediately. She hesitated, then whispered, "I need to get this inside. It's important." Marcus bent down, noticing the frostbite on her hands, the box now fully visible in the dim light. It was an old, rusted metal box, and despite the severe cold, it seemed to have a strange energy about it. As he reached for it, the girl stepped back, clutching it tightly. "Please, don't take it," she pleaded, her voice barely a whisper. There was something in her eyes, a fire that defied the freezing temperatures, that made Marcus pause. "What's inside it?" he asked gently, not wanting to force her to reveal anything she wasn't ready to. The girl looked up at him, her face streaked with snowflakes, her expression one of pure determination. "It's my father's," she said quietly, "and he told me never to open it until the time was right." Marcus studied the box, his mind racing. He had seen many things in his time, crimes, secrets, betrayal, but there was something about this moment that felt different. The air seemed to thicken around them, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. The box, though simple in appearance, was clearly more than just an object. It was a symbol, a key to something Marcus couldn't yet understand, but knew he had to uncover. The girl's story, her courage, her need to protect whatever was inside that box, it all pulled at something deep inside Marcus. "I won't take it," he promised, his voice low. "But you need to get inside. It's too cold out here." The girl nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of trust and gratitude. As they walked toward her house, Marcus couldn't help but feel a shift inside him. He had lived a life where loyalty and survival had been his only code, but now, something about the girl and the mysterious box was stirring memories of a past he had long buried. It was a past that had been locked away, much like the contents of that box. Little did he know, this simple encounter with a child and her secret box would unravel a chain of events that would force him to confront his deepest fears and the code that had defined his life for so long. The storm had intensified since Marcus and the little girl had made their way inside the house, her home tucked away in the corner of the small town. The house was modest but warm, a stark contrast to the freezing, desolate streets outside. As the door shut behind them, the warmth wrapped around Marcus, but it didn't ease the tension gnawing at him. The girl led him to a small living room, and though the space was filled with the smell of fresh bread and the soft glow of a fire crackling in the hearth, Marcus's mind was still fixated on the mysterious box in her hands. She carefully placed it on the coffee table, her tiny fingers lingering over its surface as though she were afraid to open it. "Do you mind if I take a look at it?" Marcus asked gently, his voice softened by the warmth of the fire and the rare softness he felt in this moment. The girl hesitated, her wide eyes shifting from the box to Marcus's face. "I'm not going to open it," he reassured her, "but it's clear there's something inside it that's important. I want to understand." She stared at the box for a long moment, her brow furrowed, before she nodded and stepped back. "I don't know if it's time yet," she whispered. I don't want to mess it up." Marcus smiled slightly, an almost foreign expression for him. "We'll do it together," he said. The girl placed her small hands on the box, and with a slow breath, she lifted the rusted lid. The moment the lid opened, the room seemed to quiet, the fire crackling the only sound that filled the space. Inside, there was a bundle of old letters wrapped in a faded ribbon and a small, tarnished key. Marcus leaned forward, his fingers itching to examine the contents, but he held back. This moment was not just about uncovering a secret, it was about trust. The girl, seeing the curiosity in his eyes, unwrapped the ribbon and handed him the letters. "They're from my dad," she said softly. "He said that when the time was right, I'd understand." Marcus looked down at the letters, the paper yellowed with age, the ink smudged in places. He could feel the weight of their significance, as though these letters held more than just words. They held the key to something bigger, something tied to his past. He glanced at the girl, her face a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. "Do you want me to read them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. The first letter was written in a hurried hand, the edges torn as though it had been read over and over again. Marcus could sense the urgency in the words as he began to read. It spoke of a time long ago, a story of a man lost to the streets, a man who had made decisions that led him down a dark path. But there was more. Hidden in the lines was a name that struck Marcus like a hammer. His own. The letter described the father's past dealings with Marcus's Hell's Angels chapter, a secret pact made long ago that had been buried, lost to time. "It's all connected," Marcus muttered under his breath, the realization sinking in. The girl looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for understanding. "What is it? What does it mean?" she asked. "It's my past," Marcus replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Your father knew me. He was a part of something I thought I had left behind. And now, this box, these letters, it's like everything I've been running from is right here, in front of me." He stopped, the words hanging in the air. He didn't want to scare her with the full truth, not yet. But as the girl sat there, watching him with her innocent, unknowing gaze, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of his own decisions. His past wasn't something he could outrun forever, and whatever was inside this box was about to pull him back into a world he had tried so hard to escape. The girl's small hand reached out, touching his arm, snapping him from his thoughts. "You're not alone," she said, her voice full of quiet assurance. "I don't understand it all, but I know you're not alone." Marcus swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. In all his years with the Hell's Angels, in all the battles, the betrayals, and the scars, he had never heard anything so simple, so pure. "Thank you," he whispered, the words thick with emotion. The girl smiled, her innocence radiating through the tension that had enveloped him. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Whatever was in that box had set his past on fire, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to find out what it meant. And whatever the cost, he had to face it. As he sat there, the letters still in his hands, Marcus knew that this wasn't just a coincidence. This little girl, this box, and the secrets it held. His life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. The room was still, the fire crackling softly as Marcus sat there, the letters in his hands, each word on the page unraveling a past he thought he had buried for good. The little girl, who had shown him more trust than he thought he deserved, watched him closely, her big eyes full of curiosity and silent questions. Marcus let out a deep sigh and slowly folded the letter back into the box. He looked up at her, trying to find the right words, but all that came to mind was a growing sense of dread. The box had been the key to opening old wounds, but it also held the answers to questions he'd buried in the dark corners of his mind. Your father, Marcus began, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. He wasn't just a man who crossed paths with me. He was part of something bigger, something I didn't realize had any connection to your life. The girl frowned, confused. What do you mean? What did he do? Her innocent question made Marcus's heart ache. The past was never as clear as the present, and sometimes it took a long time to understand just how deeply everything was connected. He was involved with my chapter, Marcus replied quietly, in ways you can't even begin to imagine. There was a long silence as the girl digested his words. Her face was a mixture of disbelief and concern. But my dad is gone, she said, a small tremor in her voice. Marcus nodded, his throat tightening. I know. That's the part one don't understand. Why now? Why is this box here, and why did he leave it for you? He shook his head, feeling a growing sense of unease. What does it all mean? The little girl stood up and went over to the fireplace, her small hands clutching her father's box tightly. I don't know, she said, almost to herself. But I think it's important. And I think it's connected to you. Her words struck him harder than he expected. She was right. Everything in his life was connected, whether he liked it or not. The biker life, the bonds of loyalty, the violence, the sacrifices, everything had led him to this point. I've spent years running from this, Marcus muttered. From the past, from the people who've hurt me, from the people I've hurt. But this box is pulling me back. The girl slowly approached him, her small hands outstretched, the box now looking heavier in her hands. I don't think you can run anymore, she said softly. It's time to face it. Her words were simple, but they hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. How could a little girl, so innocent and full of life, understand more about life and redemption than he did? He stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. But there was something about her, something pure and untarnished by the world, that made him want to believe her. You're right, he said finally, standing up. It's time to face it. He took the box from her hands, feeling the cold metal of the key inside, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt the weight of his past beginning to shift. He had no choice but to confront it. As he moved toward the door, the girl followed him. She had a quiet strength, an inner resolve that made her seem older than her years. Marcus couldn't help but feel a strange sense of protection toward her, even though he knew it wasn't his place. Where are we going? She asked, her voice full of hope. We're going to find the answers, Marcus replied, his jaw set with determination. And we're going to make sure no one else gets hurt because of them. As they stepped out into the cold night, the storm had died down, but the air was still thick with tension. Marcus's mind was spinning. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. He couldn't turn back now. The past was catching up to him, and this time, he would face it head-on. The girl, her small hand wrapped in his, was no longer just a helpless child in need of protection. She was the key to unlocking the secrets of his past, and Marcus was ready to find out what those secrets meant for both their futures. As they walked through the snow-covered streets, Marcus's thoughts turned to the letters, to the key, to everything he had ever known. The code his life had followed had been shattered, and now it was time to build something new, something better. But the question remained. Who would he be when everything was exposed? And how would he protect the girl, the one person who had already changed his life, from the truth he feared would destroy them both? The wind had died down, but the night still held a cold, biting edge. Marcus and the girl walked in silence, their footprints the only sign of life on the otherwise deserted street. The lights from a few distant houses flickered dimly, casting long shadows on the snow-covered ground. Marcus's mind raced with the implications of what he had just discovered. The box, the letters, the hidden truths about his past. They all pointed to a web of secrets that was far more tangled than he could have ever imagined. And now, there was no turning back. The little girl, her small hand wrapped firmly in his, was the only connection to whatever lay ahead. He could feel her presence beside him like a steady beacon, a reminder that he wasn't completely alone in this dark journey. He had spent so many years thinking he was on his own, believing that the Hells Angels code had to be followed at all costs. But here she was, a small, innocent child, with a strength and clarity that made his own path seem uncertain. She had no idea what was coming, but Marcus felt an overwhelming need to protect her. The answer to his turmoil was locked in the box she carried, and the only way to uncover the truth was to face it head-on. They reached the edge of town, where the small houses gave way to an open field that stretched into the distance. The girl stopped and looked up at him, her face serious. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the cold air. Marcus paused, his breath visible in the frigid night. He wasn't sure what the next step was, but he knew they couldn't go back. "Now," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "we find the answers. We uncover the truth about your father and about me." She nodded solemnly, understanding more than her years suggested. Together, they walked towards the old barn at the edge of town. The barn had been abandoned for years, its wood weathered and cracked from years of neglect. But it was also the place Marcus had hidden many of his past dealings, the place where the Hell's Angels had once operated in secret. He hadn't been there in years, but the memories came rushing back as he approached. The girl looked up at him, sensing his hesitation. "Is this where it all started?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed open the old wooden door, the rusted hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the barn was empty, save for the remnants of a long-forgotten past. Dust and cobwebs clung to old furniture and crates, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. But what caught Marcus's eye was an old desk in the corner, a place he used to sit and make deals with people who didn't ask too many questions. He moved towards it, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, and opened one of the drawers. Inside was a set of old documents, faded with age, but still legible. He pulled them out and spread them across the desk. The girl walked up beside him, her eyes wide as she looked at the papers. "What are they?" she asked. Marcus looked at the documents, his heart pounding in his chest. These were the contracts, the agreements he had made with people who had their own agendas, people who had caused him to compromise his own morals for the sake of loyalty. And there, at the bottom of one of the papers, was the name he had been dreading to see. "My name," he whispered. The girl looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What does it mean?" she asked again. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing as he pieced together the puzzle. "It means that your father wasn't just a part of the Hell's Angels," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "He was part of something bigger. And now, I have to finish what was started." He glanced at the girl, his eyes filled with determination. "We can't stop now. I can't stop now." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "I understand," she said quietly. "So what do we do now?" Marcus stood up, folding the documents carefully and tucking them into his jacket. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "we go to the next place. We find the answers, no matter what it takes." The girl followed him as they left the barn, the door creaking shut behind them. The night was colder now, but there was a fire burning inside Marcus, one he hadn't felt in years. As they walked back into the darkness, the weight of the past hung heavy in the air. But Marcus wasn't afraid anymore. He had a mission now, and with the girl by his side, he knew they would face whatever came next together. The storm might have passed, but the journey ahead was just beginning. The cold air pressed against Marcus's face as he and the girl walked deeper into the heart of the small town. The darkness seemed to close in around them, but Marcus didn't notice it. His focus was on the task at hand, the task he had been avoiding for years, yet now felt uncomfortably real. The girl, still walking beside him, had an air of quiet determination that surprised him. She was just a child, but there was something about her that made her seem older, more capable than her years suggested. They turned down a narrow alley that led to an old warehouse on the edge of town. Marcus had known this place for a long time. It was where the Hell's Angels had first set up shop, long before his time. The building was run down, its walls covered in peeling paint, its windows boarded up. It was the perfect hiding place for secrets. "Is this where we're going?" the girl asked, her voice hesitant but calm. Marcus nodded. "Yeah, everything is in there." They reached the rusted metal door, its lock hanging loose, as if it hadn't been used in years. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a key, and unlocked the door with a quick twist. The door creaked open, the sound of old hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from a small crack in the boarded-up window. Dust floated in the air, and the smell of old leather and engine oil filled the room. It was a place that had once seen life. Now, it was just a forgotten shell of what it had been. Marcus stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The girl hesitated at the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dim light. "It's okay," Marcus said, turning back to her. "There's nothing to be afraid of." She nodded and stepped inside. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, Marcus led the way to a corner where a large, heavy box sat. It had been left untouched for years, but Marcus knew exactly what was inside. The box was filled with the remnants of the Hell's Angels' old deals, their past, their debts, and their betrayals. It was the last piece of the puzzle. "What's in there?" the girl asked, her voice quiet. "It's the last part of the story," Marcus replied, his voice strained. He bent down and opened the box, revealing a stack of old documents, photographs, and a few personal items. There was a journal, its pages yellowed with age, and a leather jacket with the Hell's Angels patch still intact. Marcus's fingers hovered over the items, and for a moment, he hesitated. The girl watched him, her gaze steady, as if she understood the weight of what he was about to do. "This is my past," Marcus said quietly, his voice low. "And your father's. He was part of this." He lifted the journal from the box, the leather cover worn from years of use. The pages inside were filled with scribbled notes, lists of names, and dates, an organized chaos that only made sense to those who had lived it. Marcus flipped through the pages, his fingers brushing over the words. The names of men he had once trusted, the deals that had been made in the shadows, the betrayals that had torn apart friendships. It was all there, laid out in black and white. But what caught his eye was a single name, written in bold letters on the last page, Steele. It was his old nickname, the one he had used when he was part of the Hell's Angels. Seeing it again brought back a flood of memories he had long tried to bury. "Steele," he muttered under his breath. The girl looked up at him. "Is that you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was me. But it's not who I am anymore." The girl stepped closer to him, her small hand resting lightly on his arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to be that person anymore." Her words hit him harder than he expected. In all the years he had spent running from his past, he had never stopped to think that maybe he didn't have to carry it anymore. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. The weight of the journal in his hands felt heavier now, as if it were asking him to make a choice. He could keep running, keep hiding in the shadows of his past, or he could face it, take responsibility for what he had done, and move forward. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he had a choice. He closed the journal and placed it back in the box. "It's time to put this away," he said, his voice steady. The girl nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "What now?" she asked. Marcus looked at her, his eyes filled with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Now, we move forward," he said, standing up and walking toward the door. "We find a new path." They left the warehouse together, the cold air biting at their faces as they stepped back into the night. But this time, Marcus didn't feel the weight of his past pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was walking into a future he could build. With the girl by his side, he knew they could face whatever came next. The night air was cold, and the crunch of snow under their boots was the only sound that filled the silence as Marcus and the girl made their way through the town. The weight of the box they had left behind in the warehouse still hung heavy in Marcus's mind. The decisions he had made in the past had led him to this moment, and now, for the first time, he felt the pull of something different, something that could lead to redemption. The girl, walking beside him, seemed unfazed by the cold or the strange journey they were on. She was quiet, her eyes scanning the surroundings, but her presence felt like a steady anchor for Marcus, as though she was guiding him through the storm of his own emotions. The lights of the small town flickered in the distance, a stark contrast to the shadows of the night that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Marcus knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There were people out there, both old friends and enemies, who would want to find out what he had uncovered. But with the girl by his side, he felt like there was a chance, maybe the first real chance in years, to leave the past behind and start fresh. As they approached a small diner on the corner, Marcus glanced at the girl. "We'll grab something warm to eat," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Then we figure out what's next." She nodded, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus allowed himself to feel a small flicker of hope. Inside the diner, The warmth enveloped them, and the smell of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air. Marcus took a seat at the corner booth, watching as the girl slid into the seat across from him. The waitress came over, a kind older woman with a tired smile, and took their orders. "You look like you've been through a storm," she said, her eyes scanning Marcus, noticing the rough edges of his leather jacket and the hard lines of his face. "We have," Marcus replied, a small smirk tugging at his lips. The girl, who had been quiet up until then, looked at the waitress with wide eyes. "Do you think the storm will stop soon?" she asked, her voice soft and innocent. The waitress smiled, her expression softening. "I hope so, sweetheart. But storms, they come and go. It's the calm after that counts." The girl seemed to think about that for a moment before nodding. Marcus watched her, feeling a sense of wonder at her simplicity. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was still light, even in the form of a little girl asking about the weather. As they ate, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the conversation that loomed ahead. The girl hadn't asked many questions since they left the warehouse, but he knew she was processing everything in her own way. He wanted to tell her everything, the truth about his past, the secrets he had hidden for so long, and what that meant for her, but he didn't want to scare her. She was young, and this world of betrayal and violence was something he didn't want her to inherit. But the reality was, she already had a part in it. The box had made sure of that. "Do you understand what's happening?" Marcus asked, his voice low, careful. The girl looked up at him, her brow furrowed in thought. "I think so," she said after a moment. "You have to finish something, don't you?" Marcus nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I do," he said quietly, "but I'm not doing it alone this time." She smiled, and it was a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was the first real smile she had given him since they had started this journey, and it was enough to fill him with a sense of warmth. For the first time, Marcus didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world alone. He had someone with him, someone who believed in him, even when he wasn't sure he believed in himself. The waitress returned with their drinks, and as she placed the coffee on the table, she gave Marcus a curious look. "You don't look like you're from around here," she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that was just a little too tight. "I'm just passing through," he said, his voice steady. The waitress seemed to study him for a moment longer before nodding and walking away. Marcus turned back to the girl, who was still quietly sipping her drink. "We'll be okay," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll figure it out." She looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding far beyond her years. "I think you already know what to do," she said softly. Marcus felt a tightness in his chest at her words. How could she know? How could she understand something so deep? But the truth was, he didn't know what to do. The past had a way of haunting him, but he was done running from it. The girl had shown him that. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within him was far from over. And yet, for the first time, Marcus was ready to face it, whatever it took. As the diner filled with the chatter of other customers and the warmth of the coffee began to seep into his bones, Marcus realized something. The road ahead would be long, but with the girl beside him, he had a reason to keep going, a reason to make things right, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of his past. The road ahead stretched out in front of Marcus like a long, unforgiving highway. The girl, her hand still firmly in his, walked beside him, her footsteps light and steady against the cold, damp earth. It was early morning now, the sun barely starting to rise, casting a soft orange glow on the horizon. Marcus had never been one to pay much attention to the time of day, but something about the quiet of the morning made him feel like this was the moment when things could finally change. They had left the diner in the small town, and now they were heading toward the outskirts, towards a place Marcus hoped would give him the answers he needed. The wind had died down, but the cold still nipped at their skin. Despite the chill, there was something about the journey that felt different. For the first time in a long while, Marcus wasn't haunted by the past. He wasn't looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next betrayal or for someone to catch up with him. He wasn't running anymore. He looked down at the girl, walking beside him. She had been quiet since they left the diner, but he could feel her presence beside him like a steady anchor. She had a way of making everything seem possible, even when it felt impossible. "You okay?" Marcus asked, his voice low but concerned. She looked up at him, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "I'm fine," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I think we're close now, aren't we?" Marcus nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. They were close to something. He could feel it in the air, a sense of anticipation, like the calm before a storm. The place they were heading toward wasn't just any old building. It was a warehouse, a place where everything had started. The memories of what had happened there, of the deals made and the lives lost, all of it had been buried in the past. But now, it was time to face it. They arrived at the warehouse just as the sun peaked over the horizon, its light casting long shadows across the empty lot. The building loomed in front of them, dark and imposing. Marcus stopped in his tracks, looking up at it. For a moment, he was back in time. Back to when this place was full of life, full of men who lived by a code that didn't leave room for second chances. But now, standing in front of it, Marcus knew this was where it all ended. This is it, Marcus said quietly, almost to himself. Everything we've been looking for is inside. The girl looked at him, her eyes full of curiosity but also a certain understanding, as if she knew exactly what he meant. She didn't say anything, just nodded, her small hand still gripping his. Are you ready? Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion. The girl didn't answer at first. She just looked up at him, as if weighing the decision, and then she smiled. I'm ready. They walked towards the door, and Marcus's hand hovered over the handle for a moment before he pushed it open. The door creaked, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the warehouse was just as Marcus remembered it. Empty, cold, and filled with the ghosts of the past. The air was thick with dust, and the remnants of old furniture and discarded materials littered the floor. There were no signs of life, no sounds except for the soft shuffle of their footsteps. The girl glanced around, her eyes wide as she took in the space. It's so quiet, she whispered. What happened here? Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the room, the memories flooding back. This place was home to some bad decisions, he said, his voice rough. But it's also where things started to change. He walked over to an old desk in the corner, its surface covered in papers and old files. He began to sift through them, his fingers brushing against the yellowed sheets. The papers were a reminder of the past, of the deals made, of the lives tangled up in them, of the promises broken. But then, tucked in the back of the drawer, he found something that stopped him cold. A small, worn notebook. He opened it, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. There, written in a familiar hand, was the name he had been searching for. Steele, he whispered, the words sticking in his throat. The girl looked over his shoulder, her brow furrowing. Who's that? She asked. Marcus hesitated, unsure how to explain. It's me, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. That was my name, my code. But it's not who I am anymore. The girl nodded, her face full of understanding. You don't have to be that person anymore, she said, her words simple but profound. Marcus closed the notebook, the weight of its contents pressing down on him. He had spent so long trying to outrun this person he used to be. But the truth was, he couldn't outrun the past forever. The girl was right. He didn't have to be that person anymore. He was ready to let go of the past, to build something new. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and Marcus turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. A man, tall and imposing, his face hidden in the shadows. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It was someone from his past. Someone who knew all too well the life Marcus had tried to leave behind. The man stepped forward, his boots thudding against the floor, the sound heavy in the silence. I knew you'd come back, the man said, his voice low and menacing. Marcus felt the tension rise in the room. This wasn't over. The past was still there, and it wasn't going to let him go without a fight. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The man's broad shoulders filled the frame, his silhouette dark and imposing against the dim light from outside. He was wearing a leather jacket with the unmistakable patches of a rival motorcycle club. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The past had just caught up with him, and it wasn't going to be easy to outrun it. The man's eyes were hidden in the shadows, but Marcus could see the glint of recognition in his gaze. The girl, standing beside Marcus, shifted uneasily, her small frame barely noticeable next to the towering figure of Marcus. She didn't know what kind of danger they were in, but Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. He had to protect her. I knew you'd come back, the man said, his voice low and heavy with years of history. You can't run from who you are, Steele. Marcus stood tall, his muscles tensing, his fingers twitching by his side as though instinctively reaching for something he no longer had. His old instincts were still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike. But he didn't want to fight. He couldn't go back to that life. Not now. Not with her here. "I'm not Steel anymore," Marcus said, his voice steady, though the words felt foreign coming from his lips. The man in front of him chuckled, a low, almost menacing sound. "You can say whatever you want, but you're still the same man. And I'm not going to let you walk away from this." The girl looked up at Marcus, her eyes wide with confusion. She didn't understand the tension in the air, but she could sense that something was wrong. Marcus bent down slightly, meeting her gaze. "Stay behind me," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. She nodded, her eyes filled with trust. "I will," she said quietly, and Marcus could see the determination in her face. The man took another step forward, his boots thudding against the floor, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent warehouse. "You think you can walk away from everything? The club? The debts? You think we've forgotten?" The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had tried to forget, tried to bury it all deep inside, but he knew the truth. The past never truly went away. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to drag him back in. He stood tall, facing the man in front of him, but this time, his hands were empty. The chains of his past no longer held him captive. "I'm done with all of it," Marcus said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm not that man anymore, and I'm not going back to it." The man sneered. "You think you can just walk away? You're one of us, Steel. You can't escape that." Marcus clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "I'm not Steel. I'm Marcus now, and I've got nothing to prove to you." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room felt charged with the tension between them. Marcus didn't want this to escalate. He didn't want to fight, but he knew it might be inevitable. The man took a step closer, his hand moving to the gun holstered at his waist. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his own side, but he stopped himself. He didn't need a weapon to fight this battle. He was fighting for something bigger now. For the girl. For his future. "Don't do it," Marcus said, his voice quiet but strong. The man hesitated for a moment, his hand still hovering over the gun. It was a moment of weakness, a crack in the facade. Marcus saw it and took the opportunity. "You don't want to do this," he said, his eyes locked onto the man's. "You're not the person you think you are, and neither am I. This life isn't worth it. Not anymore." The man stood still for a long moment, as though considering his next move. Then, without a word, he took a step back, his hand moving away from the gun. "You're making a mistake, Steel," the man said, his voice filled with frustration. "You think you can just walk away from all of this? You'll regret it." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had already made his decision. The man turned, his heavy footsteps echoing as he walked out of the warehouse, his presence leaving the air thick with unresolved tension. When the door slammed shut behind him, Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He turned to the girl, who was standing a few steps behind him, watching the whole interaction unfold with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice softer now. The girl nodded, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. "I don't understand everything, but I know you protected me," she said quietly. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I'll always protect you," he said, his voice steady and warm. For the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he had a purpose, something to live for beyond the ghosts of his past. He wasn't Steel anymore, and with the girl by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The storm outside had passed, but the storm within him was far from over. Yet, with each step forward, Marcus knew he was one step closer to finding the peace he had been searching for. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden light across the deserted streets. The aftermath of the night still hung heavy in the air, but for Marcus, the world seemed a little quieter now. He had faced his past, had let go of the ghosts that had haunted him for years, and yet, he still felt a gnawing uncertainty deep inside. The girl was walking beside him, her small hand still holding his, her pace matching his. She had been quiet since the encounter with the man from his past, but Marcus could feel her presence beside him like a quiet reassurance. They had walked away from the warehouse without looking back, but the tension from that moment still lingered. The girl broke the silence. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, her voice soft, but filled with an edge of concern. Marcus glanced down at her, his face unreadable. He wasn't sure if the man would come back, or if he'd stay away. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I can't worry about him right now." The girl nodded, though her eyes still carried a hint of worry. They walked for a while longer in silence, the steady crunch of snow under their boots the only sound filling the empty space between them. Marcus didn't know where they were going next, but he couldn't stay in the town for long. It was too small, too quiet, and he knew that there were eyes watching him, waiting for the moment when he slipped up. His old life wasn't something that could just vanish overnight. The weight of his past was something he couldn't escape so easily. But for the first time in years, he felt a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to the Hell's Angels or the violence that had once consumed his life. The girl, who had become his silent companion, had shown him a different way of living. She had shown him that even in the darkest moments, there was hope, and maybe that was what he needed most. "Where do we go now?" the girl asked, looking up at him with a quiet, serious expression. Marcus thought about it for a moment, then nodded toward the horizon. "We find a place to start over," he said. "A place where we can build something new." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and trust. "Do you think we can?" she asked. Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that felt unfamiliar on his face. "Yeah, I think we can." They continued walking, the silence between them now comfortable, as the town slowly began to wake up around them. As they approached the edge of town, the scenery began to change. The small houses and empty streets gave way to open fields, the land stretching out before them like a blank canvas. Marcus felt a surge of hope at the sight. This was it. This was the place where they could build something new. But as they walked further into the open expanse, the sound of motorcycles in the distance broke the quiet. Marcus froze, his instincts kicking in. He didn't need to look back to know what was coming. The sound grew louder, and soon, he could see the figures approaching in the distance, the familiar rumble of the engines making his heart race. The girl, noticing his sudden stillness, looked up at him. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "We need to move," Marcus said, his voice urgent. "Now." He pulled her hand, urging her to walk faster as they headed toward the cover of the trees on the edge of the field. The motorcycles were getting closer, and Marcus knew that they wouldn't just pass by. Whoever they were looking for him. The girl, still trusting him without question, quickened her pace, keeping close as they disappeared into the shadows of the trees. They found shelter behind a small, weathered barn that had been long abandoned. The girl looked up at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's happening?" she asked again, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus crouched down to her level, looking into her eyes. "They're coming for me," he said softly, but firmly. "They won't stop until they get what they want." The girl nodded, but there was no fear in her expression, just a quiet determination. "But we'll be okay, right?" she asked. Marcus smiled at her, his heart swelling with pride. "Yeah, we'll be okay," he said. But deep down, Marcus knew that this wasn't over. The past had come for him once again, and it wasn't going to let go without a fight. He had made a promise, to himself, and to her, that he wouldn't go back to the life he once lived. But the road ahead was going to be harder than he could ever imagine. The sound of the motorcycles was now deafening, and Marcus knew they were close. He took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to come. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. He had the girl by his side, and that, more than anything, gave him the strength to face whatever the future held. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, reverberating through the trees, and Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The bikes were getting closer, their engines roaring like a pack of wild beasts. His hand instinctively reached for the hidden knife in his jacket pocket, the cold metal a familiar comfort against his palm. He glanced at the girl, who was crouching beside him, her eyes wide with confusion but not fear. She trusted him completely, and for a moment, Marcus wished he could reassure her that everything would be fine. But deep down, he knew the truth. They were in danger, and the people chasing them weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. He looked around quickly. The barn they were hiding behind offered little cover, but it would have to do. They had no time to run further. "Stay close," Marcus whispered, his voice low and urgent. The girl nodded silently, her small hand gripping his. They both huddled against the barn wall, blending into the shadows, the sound of the approaching motorcycles now deafening. Marcus's mind raced, but his focus remained sharp. He could hear the bikes slowing down, their riders stopping just a few yards away from their hiding spot. Marcus held his breath, waiting for the inevitable. He didn't know who they were yet, but he could feel the weight of their presence. The girl shifted slightly beside him, her eyes darting around nervously. Marcus put a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. They had to stay hidden, just a little longer. He waited, his heartbeat steady but quickening with each passing second. The riders dismounted, their heavy boots crunching on the frozen ground. "You know he's here," one of them said, his voice deep and cold. "I can feel it. He won't get away this time." Marcus's grip on the knife tightened. His pulse was pounding in his ears. He had to make a choice, fight or run. The odds weren't in his favor, but running wasn't an option anymore. He couldn't leave the girl alone. He looked down at her once more. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The girl nodded, her face determined. Marcus turned his attention back to the men, listening carefully. The riders were speaking in low voices, discussing something Marcus couldn't make out. He couldn't risk exposing himself by getting too close. He had to make sure they didn't find the girl. Slowly, Marcus shifted into a crouch, moving silently across the barn floor, his muscles tense and ready. Every step was calculated, every breath steady. He made his way to the corner of the barn, where a stack of old crates provided some cover. He peered around them, catching sight of the men. There were 4 of them, all wearing leather jackets with the same insignia Marcus had once worn. His stomach twisted with the weight of their presence, the familiar faces, the lives they'd all lived together. But that was the past, and Marcus had to remind himself of that. They were no longer his brothers. He wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't Steele. He was Marcus. The girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "What are they saying?" she whispered, her small voice filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Marcus turned to her, his eyes locking with hers. He could see the trust in her gaze, and it fueled him in ways he didn't think possible. "I'm going to get us out of here," he promised her, his voice steady. "Just stay quiet. Let me do the talking." He turned his attention back to the men, waiting for the right moment. The leader of the group was standing with his back to Marcus, his hands resting on his hips as he scanned the area. The other men were talking among themselves, but the leader was the one Marcus needed to watch. If anyone recognized him, it would be him. Marcus's pulse quickened as the leader turned slightly, his face just within Marcus's line of sight. That was it. This was the moment. Marcus stepped out from behind the crates, his hand gripping the knife. The leader's eyes locked onto him, his face lighting up with recognition. "Steele," he muttered, disbelief in his voice. "I knew you'd come crawling back. Thought you could leave us behind, huh?" Marcus's grip tightened around the knife, but he didn't make a move. "I'm not Steele anymore," he said, his voice cold and calm. The leader's expression shifted, and the other men turned to face Marcus. They hadn't expected this. "What's that supposed to mean?" one of the men asked, a sneer on his face. Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding, his voice unwavering. "It means I'm done. I don't owe you anything, and I'm not going to be a part of this life anymore." The leader stepped closer, his hand going to his waistband, but Marcus was faster. He took one quick step forward, his knife flashing in the dim light, and in one fluid motion he slashed across the leader's hand, knocking the gun out of his grasp. The leader stepped back in surprise, clutching his hand, blood dripping from the wound. The other men hesitated, their eyes flicking between Marcus and their injured leader. "This doesn't have to end like this," Marcus said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "You walk away now, and we're done. But if you come any closer, I'll make sure you regret it." The tension in the air was thick, the threat palpable. The leader's eyes narrowed, but he didn't make another move. The other men were still hesitant, unsure of how to proceed. After a long pause, the leader gave a sharp nod. "This isn't over, Steele," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "We'll be back. And next time, you won't be able to walk away." With that, the men turned and walked back toward their bikes, their engines roaring to life as they sped off into the distance. Marcus stood still, watching them disappear into the night. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he had made it. They were safe, for now. He turned to the girl, who was watching him from the barn doorway. She stepped forward, her eyes wide. Did you do it?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. Marcus nodded, his breath heavy but steady. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "We're safe." The girl smiled, relief washing over her face. She had trusted him, and he had kept his promise. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders. They were safe. For now. The air was still heavy with the tension of the night, but as the roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The battle wasn't over, but the immediate threat had passed. They were safe, for now. Marcus stood there for a moment, his hands still gripping the knife, his breathing slow but heavy. He had confronted his past in ways he hadn't expected, but now that the dust was settling, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The girl, who had stayed hidden behind the barn during the standoff, now stepped forward, her small figure casting a shadow in the dim light of the night. She looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes, and for the first time since they had begun this journey, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Are we really safe now?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Marcus turned to her, his heart swelling with an emotion he wasn't used to, care. "For now, we are," he replied softly. "But we need to keep moving. They'll come back." She nodded solemnly, her face serious as she looked around the deserted landscape. "Where do we go?" she asked. Marcus thought for a moment. He didn't have all the answers. He hadn't planned for this moment. But in a way, he realized he didn't need to plan everything. The girl had already shown him that. She had shown him that there was still time for them to start over, that there was still hope for a future that wasn't tied to his past. "We head east," he said, his voice firm with newfound determination. "There's a place out there where we can lay low for a while. A place where we can figure out what comes next." The girl didn't ask any more questions. She just nodded and took a step forward, her small hand slipping back into his. It was strange how much weight that simple touch carried. Marcus had spent his life fighting alone, keeping to himself, pushing others away. But now, with the girl by his side, he felt the strength of their bond in ways he hadn't expected. They walked in silence for a while, the path ahead lit only by the soft glow of the early morning light. The world felt quieter now, as though the storm had passed, and they were moving into a new chapter. Marcus couldn't help but look at the girl every now and then. She walked with such determination, such quiet confidence, that it made him question everything he had ever believed about his own strength. The innocence in her eyes, the way she carried herself, it was all a reminder that there was more to life than the battles he had fought. "Thank you," Marcus said, breaking the silence. The girl glanced up at him, her expression soft. "For what?" she asked, her voice curious. "For not being afraid," he said. "For showing me that there's more to life than just running away from everything." She smiled then, a small but genuine smile that made Marcus's heart ache in a way he wasn't used to. "I'm not afraid," she said simply. "Because you're here." Her words struck him like a bolt of lightning. It was such a small thing, but it was enough to shift something inside him. He wasn't alone anymore. They were in this together. "We'll make it," he said, his voice filled with a new sense of certainty. "We'll find our place, away from all of this." She nodded, her eyes glinting with quiet determination. They continued walking, the world around them still and peaceful. But as they walked, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His instincts were sharp, always on edge, and he couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that something wasn't right. He slowed his pace, glancing around cautiously. The girl noticed and looked up at him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Marcus stopped and crouched down in front of her, his eyes scanning the landscape. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But we need to keep moving. Stay close." She nodded, the trust in her eyes unwavering. Marcus stood up and turned back in the direction they had been walking. They had to get to the next town, to find shelter and answers. The silence between them was thick, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together, they could face it. Just as they were about to pick up their pace again, the sound of a distant engine cut through the silence. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the wind, but it grew louder, closer. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his heart sinking. "Stay behind me," he whispered urgently, his voice low. The girl didn't question him. She stepped behind him, her small body pressed close to his as they both listened carefully. The sound of the engine grew louder, and this time, there was no mistaking it. The unmistakable rumble of motorcycles. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his side, but he stopped himself. He had no time to think of a plan. They were coming for him again, and this time, he didn't have a choice. He had to face it. He turned to the girl, his eyes locked onto hers. "Stay quiet," he said. "Whatever happens, don't move unless I tell you to." She nodded, her eyes wide but filled with trust. Marcus stood tall, taking a deep breath as the sound of the bikes grew louder and closer. He wasn't running anymore. This time, he was going to stand his ground. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, their engines echoing across the open field like thunder approaching a quiet town. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. This time, there would be no running. This time, he would face what was coming. He could feel the girl standing behind him, her presence a silent reassurance that despite everything, they were in this together. The bikes were getting closer, and Marcus's instincts kicked in. He knew that the people coming weren't just passing through. They were here for him. His hand rested on the knife hidden in his jacket, but he didn't pull it out yet. He wasn't sure if that would be enough, if he could stop what was coming with a simple blade. The bikes were just over the rise now, their headlights cutting through the early morning fog like searching eyes. Marcus glanced over his shoulder at the girl, her face calm, but her wide eyes betraying her anxiety. He crouched down slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay behind me, no matter what happens." She nodded, her hand gripping the back of his jacket as if to hold herself steady. "I will," she said quietly. Marcus turned back toward the road and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. The group was coming closer. He could see them now, 4 men, all riding in a tight formation. Their leather jackets shimmered in the dim light, the patches marking them as members of a rival gang, a gang that Marcus had once known all too well. He recognized the leader instantly. Viper. The man's sharp features were just visible beneath his helmet, his eyes cold and calculating as he scanned the area. Marcus's blood ran cold. This was no coincidence. They had been tracking him, waiting for the right moment. Now, that moment had come. As the bike slowed down, Viper's voice cut through the quiet air. "Steele, I knew you couldn't stay hidden forever." Marcus stepped forward, his stance firm. "I'm not Steele anymore," he said, his voice low but steady. "I've left that life behind." Viper chuckled, a sound that was more dangerous than any words could have been. "You think you can just walk away? You think you can leave all of this behind and disappear?" He gestured toward the girl. "You think she'll let you?" Marcus clenched his fists. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her too. He couldn't let them drag her into this. "I'm not here to fight," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm done with all of this." The man who had spoken earlier, one of Viper's lieutenants, snorted in disbelief. "You're kidding, right? You think you can just throw away everything we've built?" Marcus didn't respond. He wasn't interested in their threats. They weren't going to stop until they had something, and that something was him. Viper motioned to his men, and without warning, they dismounted their bikes, the heavy sound of their boots hitting the ground echoing in the still air. Marcus's heart raced. There was no way out. No way to talk his way out of this one. "You've made your choice," Viper said coldly, his hand moving toward his belt. "Now you'll pay for it." Marcus's hand tightened around the knife. He didn't want to fight, but he wouldn't hesitate if it came to that. As Viper took another step forward, Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. He wasn't going to let them take this moment from him. He wasn't going to let them hurt the girl. "Stay behind me," Marcus whispered again, louder this time. The girl, her face, a mask of determination, nodded without question. She understood what was at stake. Viper's eyes flicked over to her, his lips curling into a smirk. "You think she'll save you?" he taunted. "She's just a kid." Marcus stepped forward, blocking Viper's path. "I said I'm done with this," he repeated. "And I'm not leaving without her." Viper stopped in his tracks, his smirk faltering for just a moment. "You're going to regret this," he said, and in that instant, Marcus knew the fight was inevitable. As Viper lunged forward, Marcus reacted instinctively. He moved faster than he thought possible, his hand gripping the knife as he sidestepped Viper's advance, using the man's momentum against him. Viper staggered, barely catching himself as Marcus turned to face him. "You think you can fight me?" Viper sneered, blood dripping from the cut across his cheek. I've trained for this my whole life. Marcus's eyes hardened. I'm not the man you think I am, he said, his voice cold. And I don't fight for the same reasons anymore. Before Viper could recover, Marcus pressed the knife to his throat, keeping him in place. You're out of your league now, Marcus said quietly. The others behind Viper looked on in silence, hesitant but unsure whether to intervene. Marcus knew they were waiting for Viper's signal. The tension in the air was thick, but Marcus didn't take his eyes off Viper. I'm leaving, Marcus said, his voice still steady, unwavering. And you're not going to stop me. Viper's glare could have burned through steel, but he said nothing, his hand slowly dropping away from his waistband. The standoff lasted only a few more moments before Viper signaled to his men. The group backed off, slowly retreating to their bikes. This isn't over, Steel, Viper spat, his voice dripping with venom. We'll find you. And when we do, you won't get away again. Marcus didn't respond. He just watched them ride off into the distance, the roar of their engines fading away. When the last of the bikes was out of sight, Marcus finally relaxed, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The girl stepped out from behind him, looking up at him with wide eyes. You did it, she said, her voice soft with awe. Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. We're not done yet, he said quietly. But we'll be soon. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. They had made it through another fight, and they would keep going. Together. The morning light broke over the horizon, casting a soft glow across the open field as Marcus and the girl made their way down the dirt road, the weight of the last few days still heavy on their shoulders. The air was crisp, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like the calm after a storm. They had survived the battle, but there was still so much ahead. As they walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps crunching in the frozen earth was the only thing that filled the quiet morning. Marcus looked down at the girl beside him. Her small figure was barely visible against the vast emptiness of the land, but there was something powerful about her presence, something that gave him hope. She had trusted him, followed him without question, and in return, he had promised to protect her. She had been the catalyst that helped him find the strength to confront his past. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't running anymore. We're almost there, Marcus said, his voice low, but filled with determination. The girl looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the same quiet confidence he had seen in her since the moment they met. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere safe, Marcus replied, his words firm. A place where we can finally be free. They had traveled far, leaving behind the shadows of his former life. But Marcus knew they were getting closer to something real. Something that didn't involve motorcycles, dangerous men, or the weight of a past that had kept him chained for so long. The girl's footsteps quickened, as though she too felt the promise of something new ahead. Marcus smiled at her, glad to see the spark of hope in her eyes. We'll make it, he said, more to reassure himself than anything else. No matter what comes next, we'll make it. As they neared the edge of the road, Marcus saw a small cabin in the distance, nestled against the edge of a forest. It was simple, isolated, but it was exactly what they needed. No one knew them here. No one would come looking. The weight of the world seemed to lift off his shoulders as he walked toward the cabin. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he had found a place where he could finally breathe. When they reached the cabin, Marcus paused, taking a moment to look around. The world was quiet, and for once, it didn't feel like the storm was about to consume him. This is it, Marcus said quietly, turning to the girl. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with wonder. Is this where we're going to stay? She asked, her voice full of hope. Marcus nodded, his hand resting on the door. Yes, for as long as we need. He opened the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloping them. It was small, but cozy, with a fire already crackling in the hearth. The smell of wood and earth filled the air, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Marcus felt a sense of peace. He took a deep breath, letting the weight of the past slide off his back. We're safe here, Marcus said, turning to the girl as she looked around the cabin. She stepped forward, her small hand reaching out to touch the wooden beams of the ceiling. It's beautiful, she whispered, her voice full of awe. Marcus smiled, his heart swelling with pride. She had been through so much, and yet, she was still full of wonder. He was determined to keep it that way. He would protect her, Give her a life without fear, without the shadows of the past looming over them. It is, he said softly. And it's ours. They sat together by the fire, the warmth spreading through them both. Marcus felt his muscles relax, the tension of the last few days finally easing. The girl sat across from him, her eyes wide and full of questions, but also full of trust. What happens now? She asked, breaking the silence. Marcus looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. Now we start fresh, he said, his voice steady. We leave everything behind, and we build a life that's ours. No more running. The girl smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Marcus's heart ache. He had promised her a new beginning, and for the first time, he believed it. He wasn't just running anymore. He was home. They spent the day settling into the cabin, unpacking what little they had, making the small space feel like their own. Marcus built a fire in the hearth while the girl found a spot by the window, her eyes scanning the open field outside. They had no plans for the future, no roadmap to follow. But in that moment, they had everything they needed. They had each other. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the land, Marcus stood at the window, looking out at the horizon. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace settle in his chest. He had been lost for so long, haunted by his past, by the mistakes he had made. But now, with the girl by his side, he knew he had finally found his way. It wasn't the life he had imagined, but it was the one he was meant to have. They would face whatever came next together. And no matter how dark the world outside became, Marcus knew they would be okay. The storm had passed, and with the girl beside him, he knew they could build something new, something better, starting now.